You're listening to a podcast by Way Collective, a contemplative community for love and liberation in Santa Barbara, California. This recording was the conversation starter at our Dinner and Dialogue gathering on February 25th, 2026. Thanks for tuning in. All right, so tonight we're beginning a series of Lenten conversations, and for those of you who may or may not know, Lent traditionally is a time for giving up and letting go. But there's a very real difference between entering into a season of intentional spiritual practice and becoming a full-on ascetic. Spiritual practices are constructive, and they can often be daily habits like meditation or prayer or study or service, or even just being present as you go on a walk through nature. And they're designed to foster spiritual growth and loving presence. Asceticism is something a little more extreme. It's sort of rigorous self-denial and fasting and renunciation of worldly pleasures, a kind of harsh suppression of desires in order to purify the soul. So both aim toward maturity, but asceticism can sometimes carry the energy of force, which has its own value in a certain way. But consistent spiritual practice at its best carries this slow energy of formation, which is really about transformation. So I want to begin tonight with a brief history, because Lent at its heart was never about punishing ourselves. It was really about preparation. So by the time of the Council of Nicaea in around 325 CE, the church was already referring to a pre-Easter season called Tesseracosta, which meant 40 days, which means this season was already widely practiced across Christian communities by the beginning of the 4th century. But by the mid-4th century, Lent had become this common preparatory season through all of Christianity. In the early church, Lent was primarily a season of preparation for baptism and new life, which meant you were kind of working your way toward belonging in the community. Then in the Middle Ages, Lent became more associated with penance and repentance for sin. And then during the Reformation period, it shifted again, becoming a season of interior reflection and sort of this pursuit of freedom of conscience and spiritual responsibility rather than imposed discipline. And in our modern era, Lent has increasingly become a season of renewal and awakening, kind of emphasizing presence and compassion over anything else. So if we can catch that arc, that movement from belonging to repentance to interior freedom to awakening, then I think we begin to see something beautiful. Belonging and behavioral modification are no longer the emphases in and of themselves. Rather, we're seeing how our belonging to this contemplative tradition and the behavior of certain kinds of spiritual practices influences our becoming in the world. So in this way, Lent becomes less about rule keeping and more about presence keeping, fostering and building our capacity for loving presence. So I've always felt like any spiritual practice is really about cleaning up our presence to love. Or said another way, in this Lenten framing, the goal of any giving up is always about waking up. And I think this is where the ancient desert mothers and fathers can help us, even if none of us are planning to move into the desert, right? Richard Rohr, writing on those early desert Christians, says, prayer is not about changing God's mind about us or anything else, but rather allowing God to change our mind about the reality right in front of us, which we're usually avoiding or distorting. And that's powerful, isn't it? Prayer isn't convincing God, it's about consenting to clarity. And I need to mention that when Rohr talks about prayer in this way, he doesn't mean spoken prayer. He's referring to what early Christians called the prayer of quiet, or the prayer of the heart, which is really a prayer that's about putting on a different kind of thinking cap, really a different mind, and about learning to see the world differently. So Rohr says that the freedom that we're seeking is not somewhere far off elsewhere, or in the future even, but is rather right in our own hearts and heads. And if we can put on a different mind, then heaven takes care of itself. So this silent posture offers us no roles or rituals or scriptures or costumes or correct wordings about which to argue. And maybe that's why it seems so ambiguous and mysterious and rare. Because there's nothing flashy about it. There's no spiritual costume to put on, no performance, just awareness, just a certain kind of presence. And the early ascetics had a word for the freedom that they were seeking, and they called it dispassion. Now, that word can sound cold or detached to us off the rip, right? But that's not what they meant. Rohr explains, passions for the early church usually referred to something we suffer and suffer from, in contradistinction to something we consciously and freely choose to do. So a passion is probably much closer to what we now mean by addiction or some kind of compulsive unconscious behavior. So dispassion was not about not caring. It was about not being run by our unconscious compulsions, not being hijacked by fear, not being steered by unexamined desire. Because, and this is so crucial, we are actually the interpreters of what we see, fear, desire, lust over, and react to. So that means that it's ultimately our interpretation of any event or any encounter that prevails. Have you ever made a foregone conclusion about someone after hearing about an interaction someone had with them, or perhaps even an interaction you had yourself, only to find out that when you actually followed up with that person, that you were wrong about your assumption? Perhaps the story you got wasn't straight, or perhaps you were misinformed, and this whole thing led you down a path of unnecessary anger or disdain towards someone else? Just me? Okay, well, the point is that how we see is what we see, isn't it? And Rohr says that the point is our presence, essentially asking what love are we willing to give and what battles are we willing to fight, all depend on which inner reservoir is ready and waiting, which reservoir is empty and which one is begging to be filled, and with what precisely our reservoir is filled. And so the goal of presence becomes this: to learn to be happy and content, even when we're doing the nothingness of prayer, which sort of means benevolently gazing at anything in its ordinariness. Just being with what is, without distortion, without immediate reaction, without narrative spin. And that's where Lent becomes deeply practical, because what we release isn't the point in and of itself. It's what kind of presence becomes possible when our hands and our schedules and our attention are no longer quite so full. So let me make this a little concrete, because I notice this in my own life with my kids. If I don't consciously give up checking my phone after dinner, in fact, if I scroll for far too long, far too often, which I do, if I don't consciously let go of the low-grade anxiety of emails that are waiting for my reply, if I don't give up the subtle inner compulsion to stay mentally tethered to work, then I can be physically in the room, but not actually present. Do you know what I mean? Like my body's there, but my reservoir is elsewhere. Sometimes it actually takes them 3 dads before I look up. You know what I mean? Like, dad, dad, dad. And finally I'm like, what? And when I choose, even imperfectly, to set the phone down, to release the unfinished tasks for just an hour or two, something shifts. It's small and subtle, but it's real. And I notice their faces more. I end up laughing with them more easily. I'm less reactive to them, coming to inquire of me while I'm on my phone. So giving something up creates this space for waking up and being present. Or here's another example. When I give up the need to win an argument, right, even internally, and instead I become curious. When I loosen my grip on the certainty that I've concluded about a certain, position or person, when I release the story I've already written about how this conversation should unfold, I become more present, right? I have a little bit more capacity for compassion. I become more spacious. And dispassion means it's not indifference when we do that. It's freedom from being unconsciously driven, right? So a couple of weeks ago, I emailed the Learn Circle here at Way Collective about what topics we may want to cover for Lent, and everyone contributed some really beautiful things to the direction of these coming weeks. But Jean actually mentioned, some of the things that we might give up that aren't necessarily dietary, right? Oftentimes we talk about giving up chocolate or coffee or, scrolling our phones or whatever it might be. But she mentioned like giving up feeling bad about ourselves, or giving up judging, or giving up worrying about the future and trusting instead. And if you notice how none of those require you to become a monk, right? Or none of those require moving into a cave. They instead require a certain kind of dispassionate awareness. They require noticing what we're actually suffering from, what runs in the background, and what narrates our days. So loosening our grip on certainty or distraction or habits, or even the stories we carry about ourselves, are just as vital as giving up physical things. And they make space for deeper awareness, connection, and compassion. So these practices of letting go gently wake us up to the life that's already unfolding around us. So Lent, in this sense, becomes less about deprivation and more about presence. It's less about punishment and more about attentiveness. It's not what can I suffer through for 40 days, but what might I release for a season so I can love more fully? Because the goal of every contemplative endeavor is loving presence toward what is, toward the actual lived experience of our everyday lives, toward the dishes, the conversations, the injustices, the news cycles, and even our own thoughts and our own bodies, and being attentive to our own unfinished growth. And tonight, as we begin the series, Giving Up and Waking Up, I simply want to invite each of us to gently dialogue around the tables, asking, what passion might I be suffering from? What unconscious reservoir is steering me? What might I be invited to release in order to be more present and loving? Not because God demands it, but because your own life is there waiting for you. So in the weeks to come, we're going to explore how giving something up can bring us into a deeper kind of presence. How letting go of certain stories can interrupt disintegration and move us toward integration. How releasing our grip on egoic patterns opens space for compassion. But for tonight, the invitation is simple. We're each invited to clean up our presence to love, to walk the path of gently loosening what constricts us, and to notice what fills our reservoir, and to experiment just a little with letting go. Because every time we give something up that clouds our awareness, we wake up a little bit more. And when we wake up, we find that the freedom we've been seeking was never somewhere else. It was waiting in here, in our own hearts and heads. And maybe, just maybe, if we can put on this different mind, heaven will take care of itself. Okay, I've got 3 contemplative questions for dialogue around the tables. So the first question is the self question. Where do you notice yourself being run by something? A worry or a story, a habit or a fear that you might actually be suffering from? And what might it look like to loosen your grip on it, even if it's just a little? Number 2 is the sacred question. If Lent is less about self-denial and more about presence, what kind of spiritual practice or letting go might help you put on a different mind and clean up your ability to be lovingly present? And lastly, the society question. How might a community that practices dispassion, freedom from unconscious reactivities, show up differently in our polarized, anxious world? And what would more loving presence look like in our public life? Thanks for listening to this podcast by Way Collective. To keep up with our community, you can subscribe to this podcast, go to www.waycollective.org, or follow us on Instagram at @waycollective. Peace and every good, y'all.